The matching principle. How to fail at recruiting spies. If Jim Lawrence was being honest with himself, he had to admit that he was terrible at recruiting spies. So bad, in fact, that he spent most nights worrying about getting fired from the only job he had ever loved. A job he had landed 2 years earlier as a case officer for the Central Intelligence Agency. It was 1982 and Lawler was 30 years old. He had joined the CIA after attending law school at the University of Texas, where he had gotten medical grades and then cycling through a series of dull jobs. One day, unsure what to do with his life, he telephoned a CIA headhunter he had once met on campus. A job interview followed, then a polygraph test, then a dozen more interviews in various cities, and then a series of exams that seemed designed to ferret out everything Lawler didn't know. Who, he wondered, memorizes rug- rugby world champion from the 1960s. Eventually, he made it to the final interview. Things weren't looking good. His exam performance had been poor to middling. He had no overseas experience, no knowledge of foreign languages, no military services or special skills. Yet, the interviewer noted Lawler had flown himself to Washington, D.C. for this interview on his own dime, had persisted through each test, even when it was clear he didn't have the first clue how to answer most questions, had responded to every setback with what seemed like admirable, if misplaced, optimism. Why? The man asked. Did you want to join the CIA so badly? I have wanted to do something important my entire life, Lawler replied. He wanted to serve his country and bring democracy to nations yearning for freedom. Even as the words came out, he realized how ridiculous sounded. Who says yearning in an interview? So he stopped, took a breath, and said the most honest thing he could think of. My life feels empty. He told the interviewer, I want to be part of something meaningful. A week later, the agency called to offer him a job. He accepted immediately and reported to Camp Peary. The form. As the agency's training facility in Virginia is known to be tutored in lock picking, dead drops, and covert surveillance. The most surprising aspect of the form's curriculum, however, was the agency's devotion to the art of conversation. In this time, there, Lawler learned that working for the CIA was essentially a communication job. A field officer's mandate wasn't slinking in shadows or whispering in parking lots. It was talking to people at parties, making friends in embassies, bonding with foreign officials in the hope that someday you might have a quiet chat about some critical piece of intelligence. Communication is so important that a summary of CIA training methods puts it right up front. Find ways to connect, it says. A case officer's goal should be to have a prospective agent come to believe, hopefully with the good reason, that the case officer is one of the few people, perhaps the only person who truly understands him. Lawler finished spy school with high marks and was shipped off to Europe. His assignment was to establish rapport with foreign bureaucrats, cultivate friendship with embassy attaches, and develop other sources who might be willing to have candid conversation, and thereby his bosses hoped open channel for discussion that makes the whole world a bit more manageable. Lawler's first few months abroad were miserable. He tried his best to blend in. He attended black tie soirees and had drinks at bars near embassies. Nothing worked. There was a clerk from the Chinese delegation he met. Not, he met après-ski and repeatedly invited to lunch and cocktails. Eventually, Lawler worked up the courage to inquire if his new friend, perhaps wanted to earn some extra cash, passing along gossip he heard inside his embassy. The man replied that his family was quite wealthy, thank you, and his bosses tended to execute people for things like that. He would pass. Then there was a receptionist from the Soviet consulate who seemed promising until one of the Lawler's superior took him aside and explained that she, in fact, worked for the KGB and was trying to recruit him. Eventually, a career saving opportunity appeared. A CIA colleague mentioned that a young woman from the Middle East who worked in her country's foreign ministry was visiting. Yasmin was on vacation. The colleagues explained, staying with a who had moved to Europe. Brother who had moved to Europe. A few days later, Lawler managed to bump into her at a restaurant. He introduced himself as an oil speculator. As they began talking, Yasmin mentioned that her brother was always busy, never available for sightseeing. She seemed lonely. Lawler invited her to lunch the next day and asked about life. Did she like her job? Was it hard living in a country that had eventually undergone a conservative revolution? Yasmin confided that she hated the religious radicals who had come to power. She longed to move away to Paris, to live in Paris or New York, but for that she needed money, and it had taken months of saving just to afford this brief trip. Lawler, sensing an opening, mentioned that his oil company was looking for a consultant. It was a part time work, he said. Assignments she could do alongside her job at the foreign ministry, but he could afford her a signing bonus. We ordered champagne, and I thought she was going to start crying. She was so happy, he told me. After lunch, Lawler rushed back to the office to find his boss. Finally, he had recruited his first spy, and he tells me, congratulations. Headquarters is gonna be overjoyed. Now you need to tell her you are CIA and you will want information about her government. Lawler thought that was a terrible idea. If he was honest with Yasmin, she would never speak to him again. But his boss explained that it was unfair to ask someone to work for the CIA without being forthright. If Yasmin's government ever found out, she would be jailed, possibly killed. She had to understand the risks. So, Lawler continued meeting with Jasmine and tried to find the right moment to reveal his true employer. She became increasingly candid as they spent more time together. She was ashamed that her government was shutting down newspaper and prohibiting free speech. She told him and despised the bureaucrats who had made it illegal for women to study certain topics in college and had forced them to wear hijabs in public. When she first sought out a job with the government, she said she had never imagined things would get this bad. Lawler took this as a sign. One night, over dinner, he explained that he was not an oil speculator, but rather an American intelligence officer. He told her that the United States wanted the same thing she did, to undermine her country's theocracy, to weaken its leaders, to stop the repression of women. He apologized for lying about who he was, but the job offer was real. Would she consider working for the Central Intelligence Agency? As I talked, I watched her eyes get bigger and bigger, and she started gripping the tablecloth and then shaking her head. No, no, no. And when I finally stopped, she started crying, and I knew I was screwed. Lawler told me she said they murdered people for that, and there was no way she could help. There was nothing he could say to convince her to consider the idea. All she wanted was to get away from me. Lawler went back to his boss with the bad news, and he says, I have already told everyone you recruited her. I told the division chief and the chief of station, and they told DC now. You want me to tell them you can't close the deal? Lawler had no idea what to do next. No amount of money or promises would have convinced her to take a suicidal risk, he told me. The only possible way forward was convincing Yasmin that she could trust him, that he understood her and would protect her. But how do you do that? They taught me at the farm that to recruit someone, you have to convince them that you care about them, which means you have to actually care about them, which means you have to connect in some way. And I had no idea how to make that happen. How do we create a genuine connection with another person? How do we nudge someone through a conversation to take a risk, embrace an adventure, accept a job, or go on a date? Let's lower the stakes. What if you're trying to bond with your boss or get to know a new friend? How do you convince them to let down their guard? How do you show you are listening? Over the past few decades, as new methods for studying our behavior and brains have emerged, these kind of questions have driven researchers to examine nearly every aspect of communication. Scientists have scrutinized how our minds observe information and have found that connecting with others through speech is both more powerful and more complicated than we ever realized. How we communicate, the unconscious decisions we make as we speak and listen, the questions we ask, and the vulnerabilities we expose. Even our tone of voice can influence who we trust, are persuaded by, and seek out as friends. Alongside this new understanding, there has also been a flurry of research showing that at the heart of every conversation is the potential for neurological synchronization, an alignment of our brains and bodies. Everything from how fast each of us breathes to the goosebumps on our skin that we often fail to notice, but which influences how we talk, hear, and think. Some people consistently fail to synchronize with others, even when they are speaking to close friends. Others, let's call them supercommunicators, seem to synchronize effortlessly with just about anyone. Most of us lie somewhere in between, but we can learn to connect in more meaningful ways if we understand how conversations work. For Jim Lawler, however, the path towards making a connection with Yasmin seemed murky. I knew, at most, I had one more chance to talk to her, he told me. I had to figure out how to break through. When brains connect. When Bio Sievers joined the Dartmouth Social System Lab in 2012, he still looked like the musician he had been a few years earlier. Some days he would rush to the laboratory after waking up, his blonde hair in a frizzy nimbus and dressed in a ratty t-shirt from some jazz fest, sprinting past campus cops who were uncertain if he was a PhD candidate or a weed dealer servicing undergraduates. Shivers had taken a circuitous route to the Ivy League. For college, he had attracted a music conservatory where he studied drumming and music production at the exclusive of pretty much everything else. Soon, however, he began to suspect that no amount of practice would deliver the Rarefield status of drummers who can support themselves by drumming. So he began exploring other careers. He had always been fascinated by how people communicate. In particular, he loved the voiceless musical dialogues that sometimes emerged on stage. There were moments when he was improvising with other musicians, and suddenly everyone would click, as if they were sharing one brain. It felt as if the performer, as well as the audience, the guy at the mixing board, even the bartender, were suddenly all in sync. He sometimes felt the same thing during great late night discussions or successful dates. So he signed up for a few psychology classes and eventually applied to a PhD program with Dr. Thalia Whitley, one of the foremost neuroscientists, researching how human connects with one another, why people click with some people but not others. In is one of the great unsolved mystery of science. Wheatley wrote in journal Social and Personality Psychology Compass. When we align with someone through When we align with someone through conversation, Wheatley explained it feels wonderful. In part because our brain have evolved to crave these kind of connections. The desire to connect has pushed people to form communities, protect their offsprings, seek out new friends and alliances. It's one reason why our species has survived. Human beings have the rare capacity, she wrote, to connect with each other against all odds. Numerous other researchers have also been fascinated by how we form connections. As Severs began reading science journals, he learned that in 2012, scholars at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Germany had studied the brains of guitarists playing a Schindler's Sonata in D major. When the musicians played their guitar separately, with each person focused on their own musical score, their neural activities looked dissimilar. But when they sequed into a duet, the electrical pulses within their cranium began to synchronize. To the researchers, it appeared as if guitarist's mind had merged. What's more, that linkage often flowed through their bodies. They frequently began breathing at similar rates. Their eyes dilated in tandem. Their hearts began to beat in similar patterns. Frequently, even the electrical impulses along their skin would synchronize. Then, when they stopped playing together, as their scores diverged or they veered into solos, the between brain synchronization disappeared completely, the scientist wrote. Severs Shivers found other studies showing this same phenomena when people hummed together, or tapped their fingers side by side, or solved cooperative puzzles, or told each other stories. In other experiments, researchers at Princeton measured the neural activities of a dozen people listening to a young woman recount a long and convoluted tale about her prom night. As they monitored the speaker's brain alongside the brain of her listeners, they saw the listener's mind synchronized with the narrator until they were all experiencing the same feeling of stress and unease, joy and humor at the same time, as if they were telling the story together. What's more, some listeners synchronized particularly closely with the speaker. Their brain seemed to behave nearly precisely like her brain. When questioned for afterwards, those tightly aligned participants could distinguish between the story's characters more clearly and recall small details. The more people's brains had synchronized, the better they understand what was said. The extent of speaker listener Neural coupling predicts the success of the communication. The researchers wrote in the Proceeding of the National Academy of Science in 2010. Supercommunicators. These and other studies make clear an essential truth. To communicate with someone, we must connect with them. When we observe what someone is saying and they comprehend what we say, it's because our brains have, to some degree, aligned. At that moment, our bodies, our pulse, facial expressions, the emotions we experience, the prickling sensation on our neck and arms often start to synchronize as well. There is something about neural simultaneity that helps us listen more closely and speak more clearly. Sometimes this connection occurs with just one other person. Other times it happens within a group or a large audience. But whenever it happens, our brain and bodies become alike because we are, in the language of neuroscientists, neurally entrained.